figures crested the horizon of the Judean desert. One an old widow, the other a young one. Wrinkles creviced the face of the first, and road dust covered the faces of both. They so huddled together as they walked that an onlooker might mistake them as one person, which was all right with them, for really all they had was each other. 10 years prior, a famine had driven the elder one, Naomi, and her husband out of Bethlehem. And their family had migrated into the enemy territory of Moab. That's where the couple found fertile soil to farm and found girls for their 2 sons to marry. But then tragedy struck. Naomi's husband died. So did her sons. And Naomi resolved to return to her hometown of Bethlehem. Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, resolved to go with her. And so this pair could have hardly been more pitiful. As they entered the village, they had no money. They had no possessions. They had no children to raise. They had no farm to cultivate. In the 12th century BC, a woman's security was found in her husband, and her future was found in her sons. And these 2 widows, well, they had neither. They'd be lucky to find a bunk at the Salvation Army. Here's how the elder of the 2 women described their circumstance. Perhaps you noticed these words at the bottom of page 122 in the story, or in Ruth chapter 1, verses 20 through 21. Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. The name Naomi means pleasant or sweet. And Naomi was in such a state of despondency that she told her friends in Bethlehem, why call me Naomi? Why call me pleasant? Why call me sweet? Just call me Mara. That means bitter. Her life had turned bitter, and her heart was the same. Maybe you can relate. The woman that I recently met at one of our church services could relate. She came forward for prayer during the worship service. Her face was pale and awash with tears. She was thin, and she walked and she held herself tight as if her heart would fall if she did not. She had an unkempt look about her, jeans and flip-flops and unwashed hair. As if just getting to church was enough. Forget cleaning up. She had been recently diagnosed with lupus, and she lives in pain. Unpaid bills had compelled her husband to take a contract job overseas in Turkey. And she and her son have been alone for a year. He's gone dark, gothic. He seldom talks. But when he does, he talks about death and devils. He even recently mentioned suicide. This mother had likely never heard of Naomi or Ruth, but the story of these 2 widows would encourage her. It would also encourage a man that I met in a restaurant. He had an NBA basketball player look to him. My neck actually hurt as I looked up at him, but he's never played a day of basketball in his life. He took a job, a sales job, and then the job turned south, and then the recession went south, and well, now he's unemployed. He has been for 12 months. He has an education. He has a family. But he also has an appointment to stand in the unemployment line, a place he never thought he would stand. His life turned bitter. Hope the size of a splinter. Solutions as scarce as sunlight in an Alaskan January. And we wonder, does God have an answer? Does God have an involvement? Does God have a solution for times like these? Days of drought and doubt and debt and disease. Does God show up in places like this? in the world of sick moms or unemployed dads or penniless widows walking in from Moab. Maybe you're wondering. If so, then the story of Ruth is a story for you. Now, according to the first verse of the book of Ruth, the story of Ruth took place in the days of the judges. Now, the days of the judges occupies about 400 years in between the days of Joshua and the days of Saul. So we're right around 1300 BC, there a take. This was a difficult time. The days of judges were days of irregular leadership and inconsistent faith for the Hebrew people. Ruth found herself, this widow of Moab, entering the city of Bethlehem during a dark time for the children of Israel. This book of Ruth is a brief book. It's only 4 chapters, but it gives us a glimpse into the way God helps the hurting heart during dark times. It's a beautiful book. In his commentary on the book of Ruth, F.B. Huey called it the most beautiful short story ever written. It's a 3,000-year-old love story full of heart-stopping moments. Again, the characters: Naomi, the mother-in-law; Ruth, the daughter-in-law; and then there's a man by the name of Boaz. And the story is set in the ancient version of Bethlehem. Yes, Bethlehem. Long before Bethlehem was known for its manger and magi, and long before it became the home of a young shepherd boy by the name of David, Bethlehem was known as the stage for the Bible's best-known story of romance and redemption. It seems to me that the book of Ruth, or the story of Ruth, divides itself into scenes. And scene number 1 would be called, "It Was Love at First Sight." The women shuffled into the village and they set about to find sustenance. And Ruth went to a nearby field to scavenge enough grain for bread. Enter stage right, Boaz. Just for the fun of it, let's picture Boaz as a fellow with a square jaw and wavy hair and biceps that flex and pecs that pop and teeth that sparkle and pockets that jingle. His education was Ivy, his jet was private, his farm was profitable, and his house was sprawling and paid for. He had no intention of interrupting his charmed life with marriage. He was a happy bachelor. But then he saw Ruth. Now, she wasn't the first immigrant to forage grain out of his farm, but she was the first to steal his heart. Her glance caught his, and when he saw her, that was all it took. Eyes the shape of almonds, hair the color of chocolate, face just foreign enough to enchant, and a blush just bashful enough to intrigue. His heart began to pound like a kettle drum, and his knees turned into jelly. And as fast as you can turn the page in the Bible, Boaz learned her name, her story, and her Facebook status. He upgraded her workstation. He made sure that she had a good supper. And he told his overseers to protect her. In a word, he gave her grace. At least that's the word that Ruth used. I'm reading now from a version of the Bible called The Message. Ruth chapter 2 and verse 13. She said, "Oh, sir, such grace, such kindness. I don't deserve it. You've touched my heart, treating me like one of your own, and I don't even belong here." Ruth went home that day with a 30-pound sack of grain and a smile she couldn't wipe off of her face. Naomi heard the story and recognized the name, then the opportunity. Boaz, she thought. Boaz. I know that name. And then it dawned on her. Boaz was the kid that used to show up at the family reunion. Boaz was Rahab's boy. She was related to him. So Naomi's head began to spin with possibilities. This being harvest season, Boaz would be spending the night on the threshing floor with his workers to protect the crop from intruders. So here's the instruction Naomi gave Ruth. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Now you're going to have to excuse me while I fan myself for just a minute. What in the world is this story doing in the Bible? It's a story of Moabite seduction. Boaz, full-bellied and sleepy. Ruth is bathed and perfumed. She's told to uncover his feet and lie down. What in the world was Naomi thinking? Well, a couple of answers. She may have been thinking it was time for Ruth to get on with her life. The phrase that she uses when she tells Ruth to put on her clothes and to get cleaned up, it's an interesting phrase that's found elsewhere in ancient literature to describe removing the clothing of mourning. You see, she was still mourning the death of her husband. And as long as Ruth was dressed in black, a respectable man like Boaz, he wouldn't have anything to do with her out of respect. And so maybe Naomi was saying, Ruth, it's time to move on. Also, there's no doubt that Naomi was thinking about the law of the kinsman redeemer. Now, in the translation we use in the story, it's called the law of the guardian redeemer. I kind of like the phrase kinsman redeemer because it tells us how the kinsmen were to be loyal to their family. The law is a bit complex, but if you had to reduce it down to a paragraph or two, it would read like this. If a man died without children, his property was transferred not to his wife, but to his brother. This practice kept the land in the clan, but it also left the widow vulnerable. So to protect her, the law required the brother of the deceased man to marry the childless widow. Now, if the deceased husband had no brother, his nearest male relative was to provide for the widow, but he didn't necessarily have to marry her. Again, this law kept the property in the family, and it gave the widow some protection and possibly a husband. The law of the kinsman redeemer. So while Naomi and Ruth had no living children, they did have a cousin named Boaz who had already been kind to them once. Maybe he would again. At least it was worth the gamble. So scene number 2 would be called this: Cover me with your coat. Picking up on page 125 in the story, or Ruth chapter 3, verses 6 and 7. So she, speaking of Ruth, went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. So about this time, Ruth is lingering in the shadows, watching the men as they sit around the fire and finish their meals. She notices how one by one they stand off and disappear into the darkness to go to sleep. Laughter and chatter gave way to snores, and soon the threshing floor was quiet. And so by the light of the still popping fire, Ruth made her move. She crept between the lumps of sleeping men in the direction of Boaz, and upon reaching him, look what she did. She uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Startled indeed, this gesture was roughly the equivalent of giving an engagement ring. This was a proposal from Ruth to him. She said, I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are the guardian redeemer, or the kinsman redeemer of our family. Now, Boaz was related to the family of Naomi and Ruth. He was not in he had no obligation to marry either one of them. He was a relative. He wasn't a brother. She was a foreigner. He was a prominent landowner. She was a destitute alien. He was a local power broker. He was unknown. She was well known. But still, Ruth made the request. He said, will you cover us? And boy, did Boaz smile. He didn't have to be asked twice. He kicked into action. He convened a meeting of the 10 city leaders, and he summoned a man who, as it turns out, was a closer relative to Naomi than he. Possibly the late husband of Naomi had sold their property to a non-relative as he fled the famine. We don't know for sure. But we do know that when Boaz told the nearer relative about the property, the man said he would exercise his rights and purchase it. But then Boaz gave him the fine print. 2/3 of the way down and on page 126 or Ruth chapter 4 and verse 5, he said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with the property. The land, in other words, comes with 2 ladies that you're responsible and you got to take care of them. Well, the relative balked at the offer, and I kind of have a feeling that Boaz knew he would. And as soon as the other kinsman declined, Boaz grabbed Ruth by the hand, and they scurried off to the wedding chapel. In the end, Boaz had what he wanted, an opportunity to marry Ruth. Ruth had what she had never imagined, a man who went to bat for her. Now, perhaps you've noticed that your story is a lot like Ruth's. We, too, are poor. Spiritually, for sure. Monetarily, perhaps. And we wear the robes of death. She had buried her husband. What have you buried? Maybe your dreams. Maybe your aspirations. Maybe your desires. Maybe someone you love. Like the mother with lupus or the businessman in the unemployment line, we're out of options. But our Boaz has taken notice of us. And just as the landowner approached Ruth, our Boaz, our kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ, he came to us while we were still sinners. He spotted us in need, and he made the first move. And just as Boaz protected Ruth, your Jesus protects you. Just as Boaz was able to meet their needs, your Jesus is able to meet yours. And just as Boaz took Naomi and Ruth from bitterness to joy, your Jesus can do the same for you. You see, Jesus is your kinsman redeemer. He spotted you in the field, ramshackled by hurt, and he resolved to romance your heart through sunsets, through the kindness of a Boaz, through providence, through the whispers of Scripture, through the book of Ruth, even through a sermon by Max. He is determined to win your affection. Now, you may feel like you're marginalized. You may feel like you've been discarded. But God sees in you a masterpiece that is about to happen. So he covers you. But he covers you not with a coat, but he covers you with himself. Some years ago, there was a flight from Orlando, Florida, to Atlanta, Georgia, carrying mainly businessmen. There were briefcases and designer suits and newspapers. With only one exception, it was a gray flanneled flight. But that one exception was notable. A mother was traveling with her 4-year-old daughter. And so while all the men were taking out their briefcases or their computers. She was pulling out the crayons and the coloring book. And everybody sat back for what they assumed would be an uneventful flight. But just a few moments into the flight, they realized this was not an uneventful flight. The plane jerked to the left and right, and it bounced up and down. The pilot announced that a hydraulic system was failing, and they began dumping fuel, and passengers were told to prepare for a rough landing in Orlando. Fear flooded the cabin. Stoic businessmen turned white with fear. Everybody lost their composure. Some of the men began crying out. But the one person who was calm was the mother of the little girl. One businessman later wrote how he heard her voice, her calm, reassuring voice. He turned to see her talking to her child. Over and over, he heard the mother say, "I love you. I love you so much. Do you know that I love you more than anything?" "Yes, Mommy," the little girl said. "And remember, no matter what happens, I love you always. And that you're a good girl, and sometimes things happen that are not your fault, and you're still a good girl, and my love will always be with you." At some point, the mother put her body over the daughter's, and she strapped the seatbelt over them both, and they prepared to crash. The plane never did crash. The landing gear dislodged, and the crisis was averted. But don't you know that little girl never forgot? She never forgot that demonstration of love the day that her mother covered her in hopes of protecting her from